The police officer decided to humiliate and intimidate the little girl, but he couldn't even imagine who would come for her in a few minutes. Write in the comments where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The Sunday sun rose lazily over Los Angeles, flooding the quiet suburban streets with a pale gold that promised warmth without the weight of heat. In a modest home on one of those sleepy streets, the morning had begun in the way that Ronda Rousey cherished most. Slowly, with laughter echoing faintly from the kitchen and the ordinary clatter of breakfast. The smell of eggs frying mingled with the sharper tang of black coffee, and on the table between mother and daughter sat a small vase of daisies that Lakey, as everyone called her, had picked from the yard the day before. Ronda watched her daughter eat, observing the little details that other people might overlook. The way Lakey brushed a strand of hair from her eyes with the back of her wrist. The way she held her fork too tightly when she was nervous about something. Today her daughter was quieter than usual, concentrating on her plate as though she could avoid a conversation she knew was coming. Ronda, who had spent years studying opponents in the octagon, recognized the same tension in her child that she used to see in fighters just before the first round. "Big day ahead?" Ronda asked, sipping her coffee, her tone light but probing. Lakey shrugged. "Just school. We're finishing our art projects." "You've been excited about that all week." "I am," the girl said, finally glancing up. Her dark eyes flickered with a mixture of pride and shyness. "It's just, I don't know if people will like mine." Ronda set her cup down, leaning across the table. "Lakey, art isn't about what they like. It's about what you want to say. Same as fighting. You can't step into the cage worrying what people think. You do what you train for. You finish what you started." Her daughter nodded slowly, chewing on the words the way she chewed her toast. Then after a moment she said, "Sometimes kids say things. About you, about me. They say I think I'm tough just because you're my mom." There it was, the flicker of insecurity Ronda had sensed. She reached out, resting her calloused hand over her daughter's smaller one. "Listen to me. You don't need to prove anything to them. You don't need to fight their battles. You are strong because you know who you are, not because of me." "But what if someone doesn't listen?" Lakey asked. "What if they don't stop?" Ronda's eyes softened, though her jaw tightened with memories of her own youth. Times when authority figures, bullies, even coaches had tried to break her spirit. She had survived all of them, but she never wanted her daughter to face that same kind of darkness. "Then you remember this," she said. "You have a voice. You have me. And you never let anyone convince you that you're less than you are." The girl nodded again, her shoulders easing just a little, though the worry didn't vanish entirely. They finished breakfast with lighter conversation, what they would cook for dinner, which movie they might watch if they had time that evening. When the dishes were washed and the house had settled into the quiet rhythm of the day, Ronda drove her daughter to school. On the way, the windows down, the breeze played with their hair, and for a moment everything felt perfectly ordinary. At the school's entrance, children spilled out of cars, their backpacks bouncing, their voices overlapping in cheerful noise. Lakey hesitated before opening the door, clutching her art folder to her chest. "I'll come pick you up," Ronda reminded her, "but if you need more time to finish, that's okay. Just call me." The girl gave a small smile. "I'll probably stay late. I want to get the shading right." Ronda leaned over, kissed the top of her head, and whispered, "I'll be waiting." "Don't rush, but don't wander either. Promise?" "Promise." She watched her daughter walk toward the school, her posture upright but her steps small, as though she carried a weight heavier than her backpack. Ronda remained parked until the girl disappeared inside, only then pulling away, her fingers tapping the steering wheel with restless energy. The day unfolded with deceptive calm. At home, Ronda tried to busy herself cleaning, making calls, reviewing some training plans, but her mind kept circling back to that conversation at breakfast. She thought of the way Lakey had looked down at her plate when talking about the other kids, the way her voice had carried a tremor. Ronda knew too well that cruelty could come not only from children, but from adults, from those who mistook authority for power. She told herself she was overthinking, that her daughter was safe, that she would pick her up later, and everything would be fine. Afternoon slipped into early evening. the sun lowering gently toward the horizon. The phone buzzed with a short message from Lakey. Finishing up. Be out soon. Rhonda smiled at the screen, grabbed her keys, and headed for the car. She imagined her daughter proud of her artwork, imagined them stopping for ice cream on the way home, imagined nothing more dangerous than a spilled scoop on the sidewalk. But as she drove, something in her chest tightened. A mother's intuition, sharp and unrelenting, whispered that the day would not end as peacefully as it had begun. She ignored the thought, telling herself it was habit, the fighter's instinct to anticipate danger even in calm. The streets were empty, the air warm, the shadows long across the pavement. 2 blocks away from the school, a black and white police cruiser turned slowly onto the same street her daughter would walk. Its engine hummed, its tires cracked pebbles on the curb, and inside sat a man whose face she did not yet see. For now, Rhonda only knew the quiet anticipation of reunion, her daughter's promise, and the fragile belief that some days could remain untouched by cruelty. She didn't know yet that this was the last truly calm moment she would have for a long time. The late afternoon sun hung low over the quiet suburb, the streets cast in warm amber light that made everything appear softer than it really was. The school had already emptied, and only a few children lingered, waving goodbyes before hurrying off in different directions. Lakey emerged at last, clutching her art folder close to her chest. The project she had labored over was finished, the colors carefully shaded, the lines precise, though her hands trembled slightly from the intensity of concentration. She stepped out into the fading light with a small sense of relief, glad to be on her way home. It was only 2 blocks, a short walk she had made countless times, but today her mind replayed the conversation with her mother that morning, each word echoing like a warning. Her sneakers tapped lightly against the pavement as she followed the familiar route. The houses on either side drowsy in the summer warmth, curtains drawn back, sprinklers spinning lazy arcs of water across bright lawns. She shifted her backpack higher on her shoulders and tried to imagine the taste of the ice cream her mother might stop for on the way home, the sweet, cold reward she had been secretly hoping for all day. The thought made her smile, but the smile faltered when she heard it, the low, deliberate rumble of an engine behind her. She turned her head slightly. A black and white police cruiser rolled down the street. Not fast, but slow and purposeful, its tires crunching against the edge of the curb. At first she thought it was just patrolling, but then it matched her pace, crawling forward as if it had nowhere else to be. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She tried to keep walking, her chin up, her steps steady, but her heart beat faster, the rhythm loud in her ears. The car drew alongside her, and the window slid down with a mechanical whir. Inside sat a man in uniform, sunglasses perched on his nose. His gaze locked on her, sharp and unfriendly, his expression giving no hint of warmth. "Where are you headed, sweetheart?" he asked. His tone had the word twisted, less affectionate and more invasive, an edge of mockery under the surface. She hesitated, her voice small but steady. "My house is just down the street." She lifted her hand, slightly pointing. "I'm going home." The officer tilted his head, his mouth curling. "Home, huh? Got some ID on you?" She blinked. "I'm 10, she said softly. "I don't have ID." He muttered something under his breath, then shoved the car door open. The sound of his boots striking the pavement echoed loudly in the stillness. He stepped out with the kind of heaviness that made the ground seem to absorb the threat in his stride. Lakey's stomach knotted. "Where are your parents?" he demanded. His voice was sharper now, no longer pretending at conversation. "They're at home. I just came from art class," she answered quickly, hoping politeness would be enough to end the strange encounter. She took a half step back, her fingers tightening around the folder she held, the edges pressing into her palms. But he didn't stop. He advanced slowly, his shadow stretching long across her small frame, making her feel smaller still. His sunglasses reflected the golden light, hiding his eyes, making him faceless and harder to read. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. His hand shot out suddenly, grabbing her wrist. The folder slipped from her arm, slapping against the concrete with a dull smack. The papers inside rustled and spread, some of them sliding toward the gutter. Her breath caught. Pain flared where his fingers dug into her skin. She gasped, trying to pull back, but his grip was too tight. I didn't do anything, she whispered, her voice trembling. The officer's mouth twisted into something cruel, almost amused. He yanked her arm hard enough that she stumbled. You kids think you can talk back. You think rules don't apply to you. Not today. The apple she had been saving rolled out of her backpack's side pocket, bumping along the sidewalk until it hit the curb and stopped in the gutter. She stared at it for a second, absurdly wishing she could grab it, hold on to something familiar. But the man's grip tightened, forcing her attention back to him. Her throat closed around a sob. Please let go. I didn't do anything wrong. The officer loomed over her, his voice low and ugly. You answer when I ask. You do what I say. Understand? A small group of passers-by on the other side of the street slowed, their faces uncertain. They glanced at one another, uncomfortable, but none of them moved closer. One woman reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, holding it discreetly as though trying to decide whether to call someone or record. The tension in the air thickened, pressing against Lakey's chest until it felt hard to breathe. She thought of her mother, of the steady way Rhonda's voice had carried at breakfast. You never let anyone convince you that you're less than you are. But she was only 10. Her arm ached under the officer's grip, and fear crawled up her spine like cold water. Still, she tried one last time. Her voice wavered but carried a spark of defiance. My mom is Ronda Rousey. She's coming for me. The officer's laugh was short and bitter, echoing in the empty street. And what's she gonna do? She's not here. He shoved her lightly against the wall of the school building, the rough surface scraping her shoulder. The folder lay abandoned on the sidewalk, her drawings exposed to the wind, papers fluttering like wounded birds. Lakey's eyes stung with tears she tried to hold back, but her fear grew heavier with every passing second. The ordinary quiet of the neighborhood was gone, replaced by the heavy presence of a man who wore authority like a weapon. And though she wanted desperately to believe her mother's words, though she wanted to be strong, all she could feel was the crushing weight of being small and alone under the shadow of someone who saw her not as a child, but as something to dominate. The sun lowered further, shadows lengthened, and the scene that had begun with the gentle promise of a peaceful walk home darkened into something else entirely. The moment was poised on the edge of escalation, a fragile silence broken only by the officer's breathing and the faint, uneven sobs of a girl who had only wanted to carry her art safely home. And somewhere, just blocks away, a car approached, carrying the one person who would never let this end without a fight. The papers that had slipped from the folder scattered across the sidewalk, the colors Lakey had worked so hard to shade smudging against the rough pavement as the breeze lifted them and carried them farther away. Her eyes followed them instinctively, clinging to the fragments of normalcy that were slipping out of her reach. But the sharp pull on her arm snapped her attention back to the officer. His fingers were like iron, digging into her wrist with a pressure that made her skin redden beneath his grip. She twisted, trying to wrench herself free, but the attempt only seemed to harden his expression. He yanked her toward him, his boots grinding against the concrete, and with the suddenness of it, she stumbled forward and nearly fell against his chest. Her breath came fast and shallow. Panic rose in her throat, strangling her words, yet she forced them out anyway, small and desperate. Please stop. You're hurting me. The man's mouth curled into something cruel. Kids don't tell me what to do. You think you're special because of your name? Because of who your mother is? His laugh was bitter and humorless, at the kind of sound that cut through the air like a blade. Doesn't mean a thing here. Out here, you listen when I speak. You obey when I give an order. He jerked her arm again, harder this time, and a sharp cry escaped her lips. Across the street, the small group of onlookers stiffened. A middle-aged man in a work shirt muttered something under his breath, his brow furrowed as he pulled out his phone. The woman who had already raised hers now held it openly, filming as her hands trembled. No one crossed the street. No one intervened. The invisible wall of authority the uniform created kept them at bay, their instincts screaming that something was wrong, but their fear louder still. Lakey's heart pounded so hard it hurt. She remembered what her mother had told her that morning, about not letting anyone convince her she was less than she was. But those words felt far away now, drowned beneath the pressure of his hand, the shadow of his height, the cold authority of the badge gleaming on his chest. She thought of her mother's face, the way Rhonda always stood unshaken before an opponent, how she never let her fear show. Lakey wanted to be like that. She wanted to summon that strength, but she was only 10, and the strength inside her was buried beneath fear. The officer leaned closer, his breath heavy with the sour scent of coffee and cigarettes. "Answer me," he growled. "Where's your ID?" "I told you, I don't have one," she whispered, her voice cracking. His hand shifted suddenly, wrenching her wrist upward. The pain was blinding, shooting up her arm like fire. She gasped, her knees buckling. But he held her up with the brutal force of his grip. "Don't get smart," he hissed. "Don't make me teach you how to respect authority." She cried out, the sound carrying down the empty street. The few bystanders froze, their eyes wide, torn between instinct and fear. One man finally muttered, "She's just a kid." But his voice faltered as the officer shot a glare across the street, a look sharp enough to silence him without a word. The apple that had rolled from her bag earlier now lay forgotten in the gutter, bruised from its fall. Her drawings, her precious work, fluttered farther from her reach, the wind carrying them across the asphalt like discarded fragments of her childhood. Everything that had been ordinary minutes ago was unraveling into a nightmare. With another harsh tug, he forced her back against the wall of the school building, the rough bricks scraping against her shoulder through the thin fabric of her shirt. She flinched at the sting, her tears spilling freely now. She tried once more, her voice broken, her chest heaving. "My mom is coming for me. She'll be here." The officer's smirk deepened, his voice low and mocking. "Then she can watch you learn some respect." Her body trembled, every nerve screaming, every instinct begging her to run, but his grip pinned her in place. The sidewalk that had seemed so ordinary, the neighborhood she had walked countless times without fear, now felt like a trap. Her small frame quivered under the weight of the man towering over her, his shadow stretching long across the pavement as the sun dipped lower behind him. One of the women across the street finally raised her phone to her ear, whispering into it quickly, her hands shaking. The man beside her cursed under his breath, pacing in place as though torn between calling out and staying silent. The rest of the world seemed frozen, the only sounds the officer's heavy breathing and the ragged sobs that tore from Lakey's throat. She thought of her mother again, of the mornings when Rhonda told her that strength wasn't just about fists, that it was about refusing to break. Somewhere inside, beneath the fear, she clung to that. She tried to summon it, even as the pain in her arm made her vision blur, even as her knees gave out beneath her. Her small voice cracked, but she managed to force the words out again. "Please, I didn't do anything." The officer ignored her, his grip tightening with a determination that felt less about law and more about cruelty. His authority was not protection, but domination, and he wielded it with the arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable. He didn't notice the phones recording him. He didn't notice the ripple of outrage building in the silence of the witnesses. He only saw the small girl in front of him and the twisted satisfaction of her fear. The golden light of the setting sun painted the sidewalk in long shadows. From a distance came the faint hum of another car approaching, its headlights flickering as it turned onto the street. Lakey didn't see it. She only felt the sharp pain in her wrist, the rough scrape of brick against her back, and the cold certainty that she was trapped. The day that had begun with the smell of daisies on the breakfast table and the quiet promise of ice cream after school was gone. In its place stood the reality of a child cornered, a man in uniform wielding his authority like a weapon, and the looming truth that the threat was no longer words but had become something far worse. And as the car drew closer, bringing with it the force that would shatter the silence, the balance of power in that moment teetered on the edge of collapse. The sound of the cruiser's engine still rumbled in Lakey's ears as her small body pressed against the wall, her wrist burning beneath the officer's grip. She tried to squirm away, tried to breathe evenly, but fear kept flooding her lungs, leaving her chest tight and her eyes stinging with tears. The man's shadow towered over her, swallowing the golden light of the evening, and the murmur of voices from across the street did nothing to pierce the suffocating sense of helplessness. Every second stretched, every movement of his hand seemed louder, crueler, more deliberate. She whispered her mother's name once more under her breath, like a prayer, not knowing that the sound of a car approaching fast was already the answer. Down the street, Rhonda's car turned the corner, her foot heavy on the accelerator. Her fingers clutched the wheel tighter than she realized, her knuckles white, her jaw clenched with an intuition that was no longer just a mother's worry, but something sharper, primal. From a distance, she saw a small cluster of people gathered, their bodies stiff, their eyes fixed on something against the brick wall of the school. And then she saw it, her daughter's form, small and trembling, pinned by the grip of a man in uniform. The sight struck Rhonda like a physical blow. Heat flushed through her veins, adrenaline surging so quickly she felt dizzy. She slammed the car to the curb, the tires squealing, the door flying open before the vehicle had even settled. Her boots hit the pavement with a force that echoed, and then she was running, every step fueled by the fire that ignited in her chest the instant she saw her child in danger. The people on the opposite sidewalk gasped, a murmur rippling through them as they recognized her face. But none of that mattered. The world narrowed to the figure of her daughter and the man who dared to hold her. The officer turned his head at the sound of the car door slamming. His grip loosened for just a fraction of a second as he saw the woman charging toward him, but his arrogance remained. He straightened, tugging the girl closer as if to shield himself with his authority. His voice was sharp, defensive, but carried no real confidence. "Ma'am, step back. This child is resisting. I'm handling the situation." Rhonda's eyes burned like steel, her chest heaving with every breath. She didn't slow. She didn't even blink. Her voice when it came was low and steady, a calm so sharp it sliced through his words like glass. "Take your hands off my daughter." The officer sneered, trying to mask the unease that stirred in him as recognition dawned. He had seen her before, not in person, but in headlines, in fights replayed across screens where she dismantled opponents with precision and fury. But here, in the fading light of a quiet street, he tried to cling to the shield of his uniform. "She wasn't cooperating," he said louder now, as though volume could make his words true. "Children have to learn respect. Rhonda closed the distance in a handful of strides, her body angled forward like a predator in motion. She didn't waste her breath on an argument. In that moment, she was not the athlete who stood beneath bright lights, nor the public figure smiling for cameras. She was a mother, and the sight of her daughter's tears had already made her decision. "Let her go," she repeated, her voice cutting with finality. The officer's jaw tightened. His hand stayed firm on Lakey's wrist, though she whimpered under the pressure, her knees bending as though she might collapse. His attempt at authority faltered in the shadow of Rhonda's presence, but his pride refused to release. He took half a step back, his free hand brushing against the baton strapped at his side. "Don't interfere," he warned, though his tone cracked with the first hint of doubt. Rhonda stopped just short of him, her body squared, her stance solid. She saw every detail, the way his fingers dug into her daughter's fragile arm, the way his chest puffed out in false confidence, the way sweat had begun to bead at his temple despite the cooling evening air. She drew in one deep breath, holding his gaze so firmly that for a moment he faltered, his eyes flickering behind the shield of his sunglasses. Her daughter's voice broke the tension, small and strained. "Mom." That single word shattered whatever restraint remained in Rhonda. In one swift movement, she pushed between the officer and the wall, her hands striking down to pry his grip from Lakey's wrist. He stumbled back half a step, surprised at her speed, but she was already in front of her child, shielding her with her body. She placed a steadying hand on Lakey's shoulder without taking her eyes from the man who had dared to harm her. "Go stand back," Rhonda whispered to her daughter, her voice gentler now though it carried an edge of urgency. The girl nodded through her tears and backed away, her body trembling, her free hand clutching the folder of scattered drawings she had scrambled to gather from the ground. The officer straightened again, his pride wounded by being forced back. "You can't just," he began, but the words died on his tongue when Rhonda stepped toward him, her movements measured, coiled with energy like a spring about to snap. There was silence for a moment, broken only by the faint hiss of sprinklers down the block and the hushed breaths of the crowd watching from across the street. The air was thick, tense, as though the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Rhonda's voice was low but carried with clarity across the space. You think you can put your hands on a child because you wear a badge? You think that makes you untouchable? She shook her head slowly, her eyes locked onto him with a stare that made his stomach knot. You picked the wrong child. The officer's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw flexing as he tried to steady himself. He reached again for the baton at his hip, his pride unwilling to surrender. But in that instant, looking into her unflinching gaze, some part of him understood he was no longer in control of the situation. He had walked into something far greater than a small girl on a quiet street. He had walked into a storm, and as the sun dipped lower, the shadows lengthening across the pavement, the inevitable confrontation loomed like thunder waiting to break. The girl was safe behind her mother now, her small frame no longer trembling with the same fear, because she knew what the man before her was about to learn. When Ronda Rousey arrived, the fight was only beginning. The silence between them stretched, taut as a wire, and in that silence the world seemed to slow. The officer's chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, his hand hovering near the baton strapped at his hip, his jaw tight with the stubborn pride of a man who had never been challenged this way before. Rhonda stood opposite him, her body balanced, her weight low and ready. To anyone watching, she seemed calm, her movements measured, her eyes steady, but inside her veins pulsed with fire. Every instinct sharpened to a single point. Her daughter was behind her now, trembling but safe, and no one would lay a hand on her again. The crowd across the street sensed the shift. The murmurs that had rippled through them quieted to silence, replaced by the electric tension of people who knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something dangerous. Phones hovered higher now, capturing every moment, every flicker of expression, every breath before the inevitable clash. The officer was the first to break. He yanked the baton free, the sudden movement loud against the quiet evening. The metal rod caught the last rays of sunlight as he raised it, his face twisted into a grimace that mingled fear with aggression. He barked, his voice cracking, though he tried to sound authoritative. Step back now, or I'll put you down too. Rhonda's eyes narrowed. She did not move back. Instead, she advanced, slow and deliberate, each step striking the pavement with purpose. Her voice was low, but it carried with clarity that made him falter. Try it. That challenge shattered whatever restraint he had left. With a grunt, he swung the baton downward in a wide arc, aiming to intimidate, if not to strike. But the moment the weapon moved, Rhonda's body reacted with the speed and precision of years of training. She sidestepped, closing the distance in an instant, her hand snapping to his wrist. The baton clattered against the pavement as she wrenched his arm forward, using his own momentum to unbalance him. Gasps broke from the crowd as his body lifted briefly off the ground before crashing down against the asphalt with a hollow thud. The officer groaned, trying to roll, but Rhonda was already on him, her movements fluid, efficient. She seized his shoulder, pressing him flat, and in one swift pivot, her hip turned, her weight shifting, and she threw him again, harder this time. His breath left him in a ragged gasp, and for a moment his arrogance faltered into shock. But pride was a stubborn thing. He scrambled, pushing against the ground, his face red, his eyes wide with fury and humiliation. He lunged clumsily, trying to tackle her, to use his size and bulk to force her down. But Rhonda was ready. She ducked low, her hands finding his leg with practiced precision, and in a movement too fast for him to counter, she hooked it, twisting. His body pitched sideways, and before he could hit the ground, she had already transitioned, her arms coiling around the limb, trapping it. The hold was merciless. Pain shot through his knee as she locked the joint, her torso anchoring the motion. His scream tore through the air, sharp and raw, his hands clawing at the ground, at her, at anything that might free him. But she did not loosen her grip. Her face was cold, focused, not gleeful but resolute. The crowd recoiled at the sound of his cry, yet none looked away. Stop, he bellowed. You're breaking it. Ask her forgiveness, Rhonda said, her voice calm even as her muscles held him in place. He shook his head violently, his teeth gritted, his pride still clinging to the illusion of control. He tried to twist free, but each movement only drove the hold deeper, the pain sharper. Sweat streamed down his temple, his breath ragged. "Apologize to my daughter," she repeated, her tone sharper now, her eyes flicking toward the small figure behind her. Lakey stood frozen, her cheeks wet with tears, her hands clutched to her chest. But when her mother's gaze met hers, a flicker of courage sparked in her expression. She nodded as though lending her mother strength. The officer groaned, the sound guttural, his face twisting with both agony and humiliation. I won't." Rhonda shifted her weight, just enough to draw another cry from him, his voice breaking into a scream that rang down the block. The crowd shouted now, their voices joining in a chorus that hammered at him louder than the pain itself. "Say it! Apologize!" The chant grew, phones recording every second, strangers demanding justice in the simplest word. The officer's defiance crumbled. His voice cracked, weak, trembling, but loud enough to be heard. "I'm sorry," as he shouted. "I'm sorry, please, just stop." The chant fell into silence, the crowd holding its breath as the word echoed. Rhonda's grip remained for a heartbeat longer, ensuring the truth of his surrender. Then she released him with a sharp shove that sent him sprawling onto the pavement. He clutched his leg, rolling onto his side, his chest heaving, his face pale with defeat. Rhonda rose slowly, her movements deliberate, her presence towering over him without the need of a single weapon. She turned back to her daughter, her expression softening in an instant. She extended her hand and Lakey rushed forward, gripping it tightly, her body shaking. Rhonda knelt, pulling her into an embrace, whispering softly so only she could hear. "It's over, baby. You're safe now." But the officer's groans behind them reminded everyone that it wasn't over. Not really. The man lay broken in spirit, his authority shattered before witnesses and cameras. The crowd murmured again, louder this time, their words buzzing into a storm of disbelief, outrage, and admiration. The phones had captured everything: his aggression, her defense, his cries, his surrender. The truth was no longer his to twist. Rhonda stood again, keeping her daughter close at her side, her gaze flicking once more to the man on the ground. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of finality. "You will never put your hands on another child again." The fading light stretched long across the street as the scene settled into silence once more. The fight was finished, but its echoes would ripple far beyond the walls of that school, beyond the borders of that neighborhood. For the girl who had been pinned against the wall minutes ago, fear had begun to give way to something else, an understanding that she was not alone, that her voice mattered, and that her mother's strength would always be there when hers faltered. And for the man who lay clutching his leg, the world had shifted irrevocably. The badge that once shielded him had become meaningless in the face of a mother's fury and a crowd's demand for justice. He had tried to assert power, and in return, he had been stripped of it, left writhing on the same ground where he had once stood so arrogantly tall. As Rhonda led her daughter away from the wall, her arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, the whispers of the crowd followed them. They weren't just whispers of shock, but of something larger, something that would soon ignite. The fight had ended here, on this quiet street, but the war for truth and accountability was only beginning. The street still hummed with the echoes of the fight, the cries of the officer and the shouts of the crowd lingering in the air like smoke after a fire. Rhonda stood tall, her daughter clinging to her side, her own chest rising and falling with the slow, deliberate breaths of someone who had fought not just with her body, but with her very soul. The man who had moments ago wielded his badge like a weapon now lay curled on the pavement, clutching his leg, his face pale with defeat. He had thought himself untouchable, but that illusion had been shattered beneath the relentless grip of a mother's fury. The murmurs from across the street grew louder, a tide of voices carrying judgment. Strangers who had been frozen before were emboldened now, shouting words that made the officer flinch more than the pain in his leg. "Coward!" someone called. "She's just a child!" Another voice rang out. And then, rising above the chaos, a chant began, steady and unrelenting. "Apologize! Apologize!" The demand rolled across the block like thunder, louder with each repetition, fueled by the indignation of witnesses who had seen the truth with their own eyes. Rhonda stepped closer to the fallen man, her daughter's small hand still in hers. Her eyes locked onto him, cold and unwavering, And though she spoke quietly, the weight of her voice silenced the chant for a moment. You hurt a child. You tried to break her spirit. That ends now. Look at her. The officer resisted at first, his pride clinging to him even as his body trembled. His eyes darted toward the crowd, toward the glowing lenses of phones capturing every second, and then reluctantly, shamefully, toward the small girl whose tears still glistened on her cheeks. Lakey shrank behind her mother at first, but Rhonda squeezed her hand gently, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. Say it, Rhonda commanded. Her voice was calm, but beneath that calm was a blade of steel. Say what you did, and ask her forgiveness. The man's lips twisted, his teeth grinding as though the words would cost him more than any injury. For a moment he tried to shake his head, to mutter something about respect and orders, but another shift of weight from Rhonda, another reminder of the hold she had just released him from, made his breath hitch. Pain flared again in his knee, sharp enough to break through his pride. I'm sorry, he choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. The crowd erupted instantly, their chant resuming, their voices rising in unison. Louder! Louder! They demanded. The humiliation pressed down on him like a weight. His face flushed red, sweat dripping down his temple as the world demanded more than a whisper. Rhonda crouched slightly, her gaze level with his, her expression unreadable. Do it right. Look at her and tell her you're sorry. Everyone here will know if you're lying. He lifted his eyes again, meeting the wide, trembling gaze of the girl he had grabbed moments before. His voice cracked, raw and strained, but the words came through, clearer this time. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have touched you. Please, forgive me. Lakey's lip trembled. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence between them was louder than any word she could have spoken, and the shame in his eyes deepened as he realized forgiveness would not come so easily. The crowd cheered nonetheless, their voices filling the street, their phones raised high to capture the moment of surrender. The officer slumped, his shoulders sagging, his eyes fixed on the ground, as though the earth itself might swallow him whole. The authority that had once wrapped around him like armor was gone, stripped away by the collective judgment of witnesses and the unyielding force of a mother who had refused to bow. Rhonda straightened slowly, her hand never leaving her daughter's shoulder. She looked down at him one last time, her words deliberate and final. You asked for her forgiveness, but don't mistake that for absolution. What you've done will not disappear. The world has seen, and the world will remember. She turned then, guiding her daughter gently away from the scene, the crowd parting instinctively to make room. Their voices followed her, a chorus of admiration and outrage, but she did not pause to acknowledge them. Her focus was solely on Lakey, whose small steps grew steadier with each one she took beside her mother. Behind them, the officer remained crumpled on the pavement, the chant still ringing in his ears, the eyes of strangers burning into him with every glance. He had been forced to bow, to apologize, to confront the truth he had tried to bury beneath authority. And though he might rise again, though he might walk away from that street eventually, the image of his humiliation would follow him forever, carried on every phone, every voice, every memory of those who had seen him fall. For Rhonda and her daughter, the night was not yet over. The fight had shifted from the physical to something larger, a storm gathering beyond the horizon. But in that moment, as they walked side by side into the fading light, Lakey's small voice broke the silence. Mom! Rhonda glanced down, her expression softening instantly. Yes, baby. You didn't let him win. Rhonda squeezed her hand, her heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. No, and you won't let anyone win over you either. Not ever. The girl nodded, her eyes wet but shining with something new, something her mother recognized, a spark of strength that had survived even in the face of fear. And though the echoes of the crowd still carried down the street, though the man behind them still groaned in pain and humiliation, the moment belonged to them alone. Mother and daughter bound not only by blood but by the unbreakable bond of protection and defiance, walking forward into a future where silence would no longer shield the guilty. The chapter closed with the truth hanging heavy in the air. The apology had been forced, the humiliation undeniable. But it was not enough to erase what had been done. It was only the beginning of something far greater, and Ronda knew it. The battle for her daughter's dignity had been won, but the war for justice was only just beginning. The chants from the crowd still echoed faintly in the distance, long after Ronda had led her daughter away from the scene. The rhythm of those voices, demanding justice, demanding accountability, hung heavy in the night air, and though the noise gradually faded as they walked, its weight lingered. For the first time since she had run from her car and seen her child pressed against the wall, Ronda allowed herself to breathe more evenly. She kept her arm around Lakey's shoulders, her hand firm and steady, as though afraid that if she let go, the world might try to take her again. They moved slowly down the street, the golden wash of sunset fading into the deeper blue of twilight. The girl clutched her art folder against her chest as if it were a shield, her small fingers curled tightly around the edges. Her eyes darted nervously toward every passing car, every shadow that stretched across the pavement. Ronda noticed, her heart breaking at the fear that still clung to her daughter, but she did not speak right away. Some moments demanded silence, the kind of silence that let the soul steady itself. Behind them, the officer remained on the ground, the crowd encircling him, voices rising again now that mother and child were gone. Phones captured his humiliation, his forced apology, his failure to wield authority against the truth. By the time he managed to struggle to his knees, by the time another squad car arrived to pull him away, the damage had already been done. The world beyond that block was beginning to see, because the world was already watching. News spread with the velocity of fire. Within an hour, video clips appeared online. Shaky but clear enough. The officer grabbing a girl's arm, her cries of pain, Ronda's arrival, the fight, the submission hold, his screams, the apology. Each second of footage told a story more powerful than words alone. Hashtags surged across platforms, names of both Ronda and her daughter climbing trends, accompanied by words like justice, accountability, protection. But in the quiet of their home later that evening, none of that mattered to Ronda as much as the simple task of helping her daughter wash her scraped shoulder, setting aside the bruised apple that had rolled from her bag, gathering the crumpled drawings she had fought so hard to carry. She listened as Lakey spoke in a small, trembling voice, recounting every detail, the questions, the sneer, the moment he had dragged her toward the wall. Each word pierced Ronda like a knife, and though she kept her face calm, her fists clenched beneath the table. "I told him who you were," Lakey whispered, her voice breaking, but he laughed. Ronda swallowed hard, the memory of that sound fueling her rage all over again. She brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face and kissed her forehead. "He won't laugh again. Not at you. Not at anyone else's child." The girl leaned against her, exhausted, and for a while they sat together in the soft lamplight, their breaths gradually sinking, the bond between them stronger than any shadow that had tried to break it. The next morning, the storm truly broke. News vans lined the streets near the school, reporters gathering details from witnesses, parents, and children who had seen or heard what happened. The video clips had gone viral overnight, reaching millions, each replay sparking outrage. Commentators debated on live broadcasts, some voices cautious, others fiery, but all agreed on one truth. The image of a child being assaulted by someone in uniform was unforgettable, and the sight of Ronda Rousey stepping in to protect her daughter had ignited something larger than one neighborhood. Protests formed quickly, homemade signs raised high with words like, "Protect our children," and "No one above the law." Parents gathered at the school, demanding answers, demanding reform. Strangers who had never known the girl spoke her name as though she belonged to them, as though she had become a symbol of every child they feared might one day face the same cruelty. Ronda stepped outside only briefly, her presence met with cheers, chants, and the blinding flash of cameras. She did not wave or smile. She simply said the words that had been burning in her chest since the night before. "A man with a badge hurt my daughter. That badge will not protect him anymore." Then she turned and walked back inside, her daughter's hand in hers, leaving the crowd to erupt in thunderous applause. In the days that followed, the consequences unfolded quickly. The officer's name was revealed, his record laid bare, his history of complaints dragged into the light. Parents who had once been ignored stepped forward again, their voices amplified by the outrage surrounding the viral video. Teachers recalled bruises they had noticed on children, filed reports that had disappeared into silence. Even a retired officer came forward, admitting that too often misconduct had been buried to preserve the department's image. The department, under mounting pressure, placed the officer on immediate suspension, and an investigation was launched. It was not enough for the people. They wanted more than suspension. They wanted accountability. Ronda knew the fight was only beginning, but she welcomed it. For years, she had trained her body to endure pain, her mind to outlast fear, her spirit to refuse defeat. Now, all of that would be wielded not inside a cage, but in the open, where the stakes were higher than any championship. Through it all, she remained at her daughter's side. She slept in a chair beside her bed when nightmares woke the girl in the night, held her hand through the retelling of her story to investigators, encouraged her when the weight of being the center of attention threatened to overwhelm her. Lakey, though young, began to sense the strength that had always been within her, a strength reflected in the thousands of messages of support sent by strangers who saw her not as a victim, but as a survivor. Nurses from the nearby clinic decorated her cast with words of encouragement. Friends from school brought her small gifts and drawings, and though the fear lingered, it was no longer the only thing she felt. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the television showing images of candlelight vigils outside the police station. Lakey looked up at her mother and asked quietly, "Is it over?" Ronda turned to her, brushing her cheek with the back of her hand. Her eyes, though gentle, burned with determination. "No, baby, it's just starting, but you'll never have to face him again." The girl nodded, leaning against her mother's shoulder, and for the first time since the ordeal, her breathing evened out, her small body relaxing in the safety of that truth. Outside, the protests grew. Signs no longer bore only one name but many. Stories surfaced from across the city, from across the country, voices that had been silenced for years now finding the courage to speak. The movement swelled beyond one mother and her child, beyond one officer and his crimes. It became something larger, something that would not be ignored. And though Ronda knew the battles ahead would be long and difficult, though she understood the system would resist, she also knew they were no longer fighting alone. A single spark had been enough to ignite a fire, and that fire now burned across streets, across hearts, across every place where injustice had once hidden in silence. As she stood at the window that night, watching the glow of candles flicker against the darkness, she whispered to herself words that carried the certainty of a fighter stepping into the ring. This isn't the end. This is only round one. Don't let this story stop here. Make sure you subscribe now so you never miss what happens next. Tap the bell to catch our upcoming episodes, and if you're curious, dive into our other videos already waiting for you. And one more thing, share this video with your friends and family. Let them see it too, because once you do, you'll all be talking about it.